Welcome back to The Doctor Is In with Dr. Nadia Saba. I'm Dennis Wadan, Dr. Saba's producer. For today's episode, the doctor will be in the lecture hall. Last week, Dr. Greenhouse attended University of Arizona's CEAC short course, and after accepting this year's mission award, congratulations, she got the chance to catch up with a few of the students and speakers about their work in CEA. This week, we're sharing her interview with Megan Kane, PhD student working in the Lunar Mars Greenhouse facility. Thank you for listening.
Hi everyone, welcome back to The Doctor Is In. I'm your host, Nadia Saba, and I am here at the University of Arizona visiting Megan Kane, who is a second semester PhD candidate in Biosystems Engineering at the University of Arizona. And I am with her at the Lunar Mars Greenhouse facility. What we're looking at right now is a pink bubble and a white bubble of plants growing under, I guess, pink lights and white lights. And it's really cool to see these plants. It's mostly leafy greens. I see some vining crops, but we're going to talk to Megan a little bit more about what she's doing. So Megan, welcome.
Thank you. It's exciting to be on the show with you guys. I'm glad that you guys were able to come and look forward to chatting.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your time with me today. I know you guys are busy with the short course. So tell me a little bit, how did you get interested into controlled environment agriculture and specifically the Lunar Mars Greenhouse?
Well, ever since I was little, I wanted to be a farmer. And when I was 16, I decided the location of my farm would be on Mars.
Nice.
So having a farm on Mars, in essence, you need to have a contained environment because otherwise you'd be dead. You can't breathe the atmosphere. There's not enough of it, and there's definitely not enough oxygen. So Mars is the location of the farm, so it needs to be contained. I've worked in the space industry for the better part of a decade. I'm fascinated with human space flight. My goal is to actually go to Mars. So I've transitioned into working on this system, which is related to bioregenerative life support. Because it is an essential element of long-term colonization or long-term habitats on another celestial body like the moon or Mars, because long-term we need sustainable food development and sustainable air cleaning and water cleaning processes. So that's it in a nutshell.
So what have you learned about growing plants using controlled environment agriculture, and what is going to be especially challenging versus a terrestrial greenhouse versus one that's on Mars?
Oh, there's a lot of things that are going to have to be different in a terrestrial greenhouse versus what you'd see on the moon or what you'd see on Mars. One of the biggest differences between the earthbound systems or the terrestrial systems and moon and Mars is gravity. Gravity is different, and water, which is how we transport nutrients to plants and such, behaves really differently in microgravity and in lunar gravity. I actually did a lunar gravity experiment through one of my citizen science projects where we tested how water behaves in lunar gravity on a parabolic flight, and it was really, really cool.
So what does it do?
It gloops like you have like really thick gloopy molasses.
Water?
Water.
Interesting.
Yeah, and it's sort of gloopy, but it also is sort of floaty. It's really weird.
Huh.
So, or sort of like a lava lamp. You know how things move in a lava lamp?
Yeah.
Really like that slow, viscous movement? Sort of like that.
Interesting.
So we know that when we do a hydroponic system, which is what most of the controlled environment agriculture is based on, and hydroponics, hydro is the primary element, so it's all about water, because that's how we get the nutrients to them, and the oxygen and everything. So with the water behaving differently, obviously that's going to be a huge challenge for growing plants on another celestial body where there's less gravity.
And I'm assuming you don't necessarily want like a solid media when you're up in space?
So you can use, we don't know if we can use regolith, which regolith is what we call the soil on, say, the moon or Mars.
Oh.
We don't call it soil because on Earth, soil is a mix of organic and inorganic elements. Regolith is all inorganic elements.
Like rock wool?
So rock wool is inorganic, but when we say regolith, we mean basically the part of soil that is just like ground up rocks.
Okay.
So-
So we don't know yet if...
We don't know yet. We do know that Mars, for example, has a high concentration of perchlorates. We don't know what that will do to plant growth.
Interesting. Is anyone studying that yet?
There are people looking into that, actually.
Okay.
Florida Tech, I think. No, one of the Florida colleges is working on that. I don't remember which one. In Florida. They're using simulated Martian regolith to grow tomatoes. They've got this like thing with Heinz or something about Martian tomato.
Oh,
Martian
yes,
ketchup or
of
something.
course. Yes, that's great marketing right there. So what are you studying specifically?
I'm specifically focusing on bioregenerative life support systems, most specifically the plant element of a bioregenerative life support system. So that's,
What does that mean exactly?
all right, so in a bioregenerative life support system, which means that you're mimicking the natural order of how you take carbon from the atmosphere, make food and materials, and then process the whole like cycle of food waste and then back into food.
So we're kind of closing the
That
loop.
closed loop.
Okay.
So it's called an ECLIS system, which is a closed loop environmental control system, and a bioregenerative life support system is a part of that, where we mimic what you see on Earth, the biological cycle on Earth, where we go all the way around. So the plant-based section is where you're focused on using photosynthesis to take the carbon dioxide that's been exhaled and turning that back into oxygen, and where you're using water that has nutrients in it that have been reclaimed from waste.
Okay.
So that's, in a nutshell, what bioregenerative life support is. Those are the two main elements. There's a lot of complexities to it that we don't want to go into.
So if you're just talking about CO2 and oxygen, is there like a rule of thumb for how many plants per person you would need to convert CO2 and oxygen?
There's a few calculations on that. It depends on the type of plant. It depends on the cycle of development, because when plants are growing quickly or when they're creating fruit, they are actually producing more oxygen because they're growing quickly. It's during that photosynthesis process where you take where the plant starts growing that you gain the oxygen. What most people don't realize is that when the lights are turned off, because the photosynthesis isn't going, they're inhaling oxygen. They're respiring. They're bringing in oxygen and they're exhaling carbon dioxide. So you kind of have to watch the balance of the day-night cycle and the plant growth area. When you have seedlings aren't generating seedlings don't generate a lot of oxygen. Mature plants do, and plants that are growing quickly do. So it has to do largely with how quickly they're growing.
So,
answer, it varies.
of course.
So-
is there one type of plant? I mean, if I had to pick between, say, leafy greens and a vining crop like tomatoes or cucumbers or peppers, is there one that is more sustainable in terms of that CO2 oxygen cycle? Is there one you would choose over the other?
We don't have enough research to make that determination yet, and that's sort of where I want to go with my research, is focusing on how do we get that data to make those calculations.
Okay.
So my research is all about modeling and using data from the Mars Lunar Greenhouse and a few other controlled environment facilities, generating a way to simulate the models based on what data we do have. Well, there's a lot of data out there in a variety of formats from a lot of different space industry experiments in Russia's BIOS project, Europe's Melissa project, Japan has a project, China has a Lunar Palace, and then we have the Mars Lunar Greenhouse, and then NASA had a project running from like 2000 to something, I forget when it ran, but it ran for about 20 years.
Why do we want to grow plants in space? Why not just take all the food with us?
That's a lot of food. The biggest constraints in space flight are mass and volume, followed quickly by crew time. So, in terms of an operational
So you want
mission.
plants that would also be easy to grow?
You
Is
would
that
want
what I'm
plants that are easy to grow, yes.
hearing? Grow themselves?
Basically grow themselves, don't require a lot of crew input. You want a system that doesn't require a lot of crew time, which if you do that through automation, or you do that through an incredibly simple system that doesn't require much crew time. Those are trade-offs that you make when you're designing your system. A system like the Mars Lunar Greenhouse, when you approach it from a systems engineering perspective, you have to balance what's best for, say, producing oxygen, what's best for producing food mass, what's best for limiting crew time, and you basically make do a trade-off analysis to decide which parts of that, which ones are you going to focus on most. And even if something may not be the best for one area, it may make the others balance out better. So you make a choice to do not the best in one, but that makes it a more balanced system overall. It's always complicated when you're doing something for space. One of the things that most people don't realize is every space industry, everything that goes into space that is for humans, has to be triply redundant.
What's that mean?
That means that any system that is vital to human survival, it has to have 3 layers of redundancy.
So give me an example with these plants.
With these plants, I was going to use the example of a spacesuit, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Because that's one that NASA's actually published some stuff about.
Okay.
And there's a few interesting examples of where it's not worked.
Okay.
So a spacesuit has multiple layers, just like you would put multiple layers around your hab on another planet to make sure that it's safe. And each of those layers needs to be redundant. There was a valve in one of the NASA spacesuits that the Russians, when they did their analysis, they were like, that's only double redundant. And sure enough, about a short while later, it broke. And the water layer of the spacesuit, which keeps people cool, ended up flooding into the helmet of one of the astronauts, and he barely got back to the space station.
Oh my God, that's so scary.
Because he couldn't see, and he was worried that he wouldn't be able to breathe.
Right.
Because water sticks. Luckily, the water was sticking to the outside of the helmet. He couldn't see well, but it wasn't sticking to his face as much as it was to the helmet.
Wow.
So that's the reason it has to be triple redundant.
So if we're thinking about plants and using them as a source of oxygen,
yes,
that might be the primary source we'd like to use, but then there would be these secondary and tertiary backups. You'd have an oxygen tank, and then maybe a hydrogen fuel cell or something that produces oxygen.
You would have the current systems that they have on the space station, for example, which generate oxygen using water. So you can break water into oxygen and hydrogen. So you can break it apart when you have solar energy, and then you can actually recombine that later to recreate water. It's a great way of storing energy, as long as you don't overpressurize the tanks.
Okay.
That's
sounds
actually
scary.
how Apollo 13.
That sounded vaguely familiar.
Yeah. So you would have a mechanical system. You might have 2 layers of mechanical, and then you'd have the biological system on top of that.
Okay.
Is the most likely scenario for a bioregenerative life support system. Or you would have multiple modules for the bioregeneratives, the plant-based system, in addition to having your standard mechanical system.
Okay. What are some of the other considerations about growing plants in space? I'm thinking, nutrition, psychology. I mean, are we feeding, are astronauts getting all the micro and macronutrients from the plants that we could be gardening in space, or is this more supplementary to their diet? And talk about the psychology a little bit, if you could.
Definitely. On a short-term mission, the primary benefit for having a plant-based system is actually going to be psychological. On a short-term basis, it's easy to make sure that you have the micro and macronutrients you need in prepackaged food, and the volume of food increases basically exponentially as the duration of the mission goes on. So for a short duration, you can send all the food you need. Having plants like they do on the space station just adds a little bit of zest. There's something that happens in the human brain when we see the color green. Especially if we see like a living plant, there's just a relaxation that happens in pretty much everyone's brain when that happens. It's one of the reasons why a lot of hospitals or long-term stay facilities have gardens or have indoor plants where you can go see them, because it has a natural relaxation effect on the human body. On a long duration mission, that's where it gets harder to prepare enough food with the correct nutrients long term, because you can last for 6 months with varying levels of some of the micronutrients especially. You may not be perfectly healthy, but if you're going for a year, 2 years, 3 years indefinitely, you're going to need something to supply those micronutrients in a easily accessible way. And our bodies most easily access nutrients through our food. And the fresher it is, the better. There's definitely a psychological benefit to biting into popping
Something crunchy.
Yeah, something crunchy. I remember in my NASA experiment that I did, where I was one of the crew members on a ground-based mission, we had the NASA diet and everything. I really, really got to missing having anything fresh.
Yeah.
Everything was prepackaged, so it was either stewed or we didn't have anything crunchy except for a couple of crackers. There was actually this one type of meal that they would give us. It was freeze-dried vegetables, and you're supposed to add water, and then they become all soggy. So instead, what I would do is I would cut it open, and I would just eat the crunchy,
the
crunchy freeze-dried vegetables.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this is like eating potato chips. This is like eating more like eating a fresh vegetable.
I mean, I feel like we can get that, right? We can get dried snap peas, and we can get dried carrots, and it still has a crunch to it.
It has that crunch.
Yeah.
And that was something I really missed. And so when I figured out that I could do that, I started eating some of my freeze-dried meals that way. And then I shared that information with one of my fellow people, and they're like, wait, yes, me too.
You're a genius.
So we ended up doing that.
So tell me what I'm looking at here. Why do we have one of these, what do you call, actually, tell me what you call these modules, because I'm just going to kill
Okay,
it.
so we call them Module 1 and 2, or
Okay.
Unit 1 and 2.
Okay.
The unit over here that's pink, as you say,
Mhm.
is actually a combination of red and blue LEDs.
Okay.
Plants primarily use red and blue light, primarily red with a little bit of blue light, which is why it's more pink, kind of a pinkish purple rather than just purple,
Yep.
because there's more red than blue. There's peaks, those peaks in the electromagnetic spectrum of visible light are what the plants use during photosynthesis to generate the most amount of energy. There's being a lot of research done in the, especially in the vertical farm and indoor agriculture sphere on is white light or red and blue light, or red and blue plus a little bit of infrared, or what is the light spectrum that we should really be providing to plants, because we want them to grow well and be healthy and everything. Red and blue tends to work really well. The other set of ones that we have are warm white LEDs. So warm white, you're typically used to hearing that term, I'm assuming, when you're looking at light bulbs for your house.
Mm-hmm.
You can get cool, you can get warm. That has to do with where it is on the electromagnetic spectrum. And so when plants are mainly concerned about the light quality and quantity. So quality and stuff is which spectrum is it and how much of it is there. So both of those have a huge impact. You need to make sure you have enough red and blue light, but you also need to make sure that there's enough of it, so enough photons are released. These are both LED systems.
Are there advantages to either in terms of how the plants grow or in terms of how much energy is used to operate them? I mean, is there an efficiency in just red and blue, or is it about the same with the full spectrum warm LED?
So that's actually one of the research areas that's ongoing.
Awesome.
There is evidence for both.
Really?
Yeah, but one of the challenges in any sort of research is that you have to control for various variables, and sometimes a study will lean towards one, and then you'll realize that they didn't control a particular variable the same as another experiment.
Right, yeah.
So direct comparisons where their own light is the only difference, can be very difficult because you need to make sure that it is actually the only difference.
So
That's one of the things that we're doing in here. We're getting good data on the difference between the two systems. The two systems do have a different light intensity though, which adds a interesting factor there, because we know that the higher light intensity increases yields.
Right.
So figuring out what the difference between the two based on color versus intensity, we're still working on that one.
Well, and it seems like there's a correlation that a higher light intensity, the plants will consume CO2 more quickly as they're photosynthesizing more
Because
quickly,
there's more
which means
energy.
they're going to produce more oxygen. So could that actually be a benefit in space?
The higher intensity is definitely a benefit, as long as you don't go too high, because if you get too high of intensity, plants tend to try and protect themselves from too much light. So you need to find the right balance for different
How do they
crops.
protect themselves?
So the leaves tend to curl under, and they basically just don't they don't open up as much.
Okay.
So you can actually see the difference in the two chambers if you go up onto the thing. We might take a few pictures of how the leaves and the structure of the plant actually are different based on, we believe it's the intensity.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's such a delicate balance, because it's like,
is.
okay, on one hand, so you increase the light intensity, so that takes more energy input to do that, and I don't know how big of a concern that is in space.
It's a huge concern
Is
in
it?
space. Because
You can't just like put out these big like solar panels and collect all the sunlight that you want.
Okay, so think about the moon. You know how the moon waxes and wanes, right?
Oh, okay. Yes.
You end up with 2 weeks of darkness, unless you're on like the pole and have like something that's sticking out high enough that you can get a little bit of energy
Okay.
from what that's coming around the Earth, or maybe Earth glow.
Okay, fair.
So you're in shade for 2 weeks out of a month.
So now you need a big battery.
Yeah. So keeping energy levels up is a challenge. And on Mars, you don't have the problem of 2 weeks of darkness. You have the problem where you have the challenge. Let's not use the word
No
problem.
problems.
No problems. They're challenges. The challenge of the light density is much lower. The sun is radiating out, and the density of the photons decreases exponentially the farther you get out from the sun.
Okay.
That's physics. So if you think about it, Mars is a lot farther out than Earth, which means that the density of the photons is a lot lower when you get out to Mars, which means that you need a bigger solar panel to collect the same number of photons that you would here on Earth. And then you have to convert the photons to electricity, convert the electricity back into photons. That's not an efficient process. The most efficient processes I've seen for space systems so far have been maybe 28% effective.
Wow.
In that conversion of electrical energy back to of photons into electrical energy. And then LEDs, you then lose more going the other direction. And most of the losses on both ends are heat.
And then the efficiency of the plant itself
And
to
then
use
you have
those
the
photons.
efficiency of the plant to use those photons. So you actually end up with a very small portion of the photons that you collect from your solar panel actually being absorbed into the plants.
So dumb question, and there are no stupid questions. But why are we using lighting at all on Mars? Like, why not just take advantage of the sun like we would on Earth?
Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the pressure on Mars is 1/100th of an atmosphere. It's really, really low.
I'm trying to think of...
You would depressurize.
Okay, well, can it be a pressurized module?
Well, then you have one of the challenges we see in greenhouses, which is every layer of plastic or glass you put between the sun's rays and the plant decreases the amount of photons that get through. So we still have the same inefficiency problem.
Okay.
We also can't seal, oftentimes, glass or
That is hard.
plastic as well as we could if we did a fully contained system.
Okay.
And on the moon, obviously,
the 12 or 14 days, 2 weeks of no light.
So
I mean, it's interesting just thinking about comparisons between Mars and the moon, and that these are really two different problems to solve in multiple ways.
The problems to solve that are different are the power generation. You can build the same system that would work in both if you make the assumption that you want to use a completely closed environment that doesn't use the external light. And then you just have the power challenge. Either way, power is going to be a limiting factor. Whether it's you need bigger solar panels or you need a big battery to handle the 2 weeks. So regardless of which way you look at it, it's going to be a lot of energy efficiency requirements. So basically, one of the things we want to find is where is the balance point between the energy coming into the system with the resources in the system to get an acceptable amount of oxygen and food while limiting the amount of resources it takes to get that.
Yeah.
Because water and power are limited resources. And then, of course, crouton is also a limited resource.
Right. I have to ask because, I come from HVAC and climate control.
Yep.
How the heck are you controlling the climate in these modules? And how would you do it in space? I mean...
Yeah, it's a bit of a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a challenge down here on Earth. I mean, we haven't even figured out how to do it right down here, let alone up in space.
So, in space, we do have systems that work pretty well. I will tell you this, getting rid of heat in a vacuum is a challenge. It will be less of a challenge on the moon and Mars simply because instead of having to radiate heat out into deep space, meaning panels that are facing deep space, black panels facing deep space is how we pull energy away from the space station or from our satellites. So you have back facing the black of space, and that is where you radiate heat off. So actually
radiant cooling,
because you're in a vacuum is the only thing you can do. It's basically it gets really complicated when you start doing vacuum dynamics.
Vacuum dynamics.
Yeah. So especially heat transfer in a vacuum is a real challenge. But you're looking at something that's so cold that it just wicks heat away. But you have to get the heat to the place that's radiating that.
Oh my gosh.
So overheating is a real challenge in orbit. On a planet, it's less of a challenge because there is some atmosphere that can then use that can pull that you can use convection stuff to pull some of that energy away. It's not just being radiated out to deep space.
Interesting.
So I expect less problems with getting rid of heat on the moon and Mars than we've seen in space. However, you also have then the opposite problem where it's getting too cool.
Right. That can happen
too.
too.
The heat go away. You have the problem of it can get too cool. So a lot of this particular system is based off of a very standard HVAC system. We take the air, we dehumidify it and cool it and reintroduce it back into the system because the lights are actually our primary heat source. They generate a lot of heat.
Even LEDs.
The LEDs, when we were using the high pressure sodiums, the data was even more
oh my god, it was crazy.
They were using water cooled high pressure sodiums, and yeah, it's a lot of heat. We're actually using water cooled LEDs in the white light chamber.
How do you like those?
I would prefer to have something that didn't require water cooling because it's an additional system which it adds a redundancy, which creates the necessity for an additional control. Because if that breaks down, then you have to put in another. Then it can overheat more easily. And
does it also reduce the number of photons?
It does.
Or the light intensity?
Yeah. It basically puts a barrier between the light emitter diode, which is what LED stands for, and the plants. So it puts a barrier similar to what you would just see if you put when you're seeing the sunlight go through the glass of a greenhouse. So it does reduce the amount of the light intensity when you have that. So ideally, we would put in a system that didn't require that, because the more complexity in the system, the more likely it is to break.
Where are you getting the water?
The water is from the tap here in Tucson.
Okay. If you're in space, I mean,
If
is it
you're in-
people's pee and sweat? I mean, is that
That is
basically
the
source?
ideal. That is
Okay.
idealized how you would do it.
Okay. What's the problem with that theory?
So the problem with that theory right now is that we don't actually have one of these systems in space doing that.
Oh, okay.
The water used in systems in space is basically the same water that's used in like the drinking or the gray water that's used for cooking and stuff up there. And
So on the International Space
Space
Station, they actually took the water up with them?
yes, they take the water up with them, and they extract as much of it as possible and reuse it. They're, I think, at 90% efficiency with the
Okay.
mechanical system.
That's pretty good.
So ideally what you would do is you would do, for a fully regenerative, bioregenerative life support system, you'd have that mechanical system that would pull out as much of the water as possible, and then you would take the brine left from that and run it through, say, a process to sterilize it, to get rid of
Okay.
any bacteria, etc. And then you would use that to mix your nutrients, convert the ammonium and such back into nitrates that the plants can uptake.
Cool.
Similar to what you do in aquaponics.
Yeah. Where does that other 10% go?
Right now, it gets burnt up in the atmosphere when they do reentry of the CRV. Not CRV, I forget. Cygnus. Whichever ones burn up in the atmosphere. Not the SpaceX ones. The resupply missions that burn up in the atmosphere on return,
Yeah.
that's where it goes.
The other 10%.
Yep, all the trash on the space station gets burnt up in the atmosphere
There's
on reentry.
trash?
Yeah.
They're not reusing everything?
They can't. If they don't bring it down for sampling, which they bring down on like the Dragon and the Soyuz, there's sampling
I guess
capacity.
they are taking samples. Yeah, okay.
If everything else gets stuck into the resupply mission things, which are single use, and they plan the reentry into the atmosphere so that the entire thing burns up and turns into plasma in the
Oh my
atmosphere
goodness.
due to the friction of reentry.
I'm not even going to ask where that goes. Okay, let's bring it back. So
I do come from the space side.
I know. Well, and that's actually the next question I want to ask you is you have all this experience with NASA and your interest in space and going up to space. How did you land on food and plant production?
It's one of the areas that needs a whole lot of work to be at the level we need it if we actually want to have a base on the moon or a base on Mars. And it's an area that I've always been interested in.
Yeah.
I've always been interested in agriculture, always been interested in plants and animals. And so when I left my last startup with COVID, I was looking at what should I do next? What do I want to do next when I grow up? When I grow up next? And I was looking for an option, and bioregenerative life support is something I've been looking into and following the research on since I was 16.
Wow.
So when I realized that this program existed here and the Mars Lunar Greenhouse, Biosphere, it's actually Biosphere that brought me to the University of Arizona.
Okay.
And that's how I found out about all this programs here. I was like, that's what I want to work on.
Very cool. How did you find the biosphere?
Well, I knew about Biosphere because I'd read about it and the experiments and everything. And I was just trying to find a program, and I Googled the Biosphere because I thought maybe something might be affiliated with it. And then I realized that the University of Arizona was affiliated with it, so I started looking at the programs there.
Awesome.
And now here I am.
So who is on your committee? Who are your major professors?
So far I have Dr. Kachira, who runs the Controlled Environment Agriculture, as my major professor. We're still building my committee. I've got a couple potentials, but nobody's signed on yet. So,
Okay.
Shouldn't name names.
I gotcha.
So still building my committee, but I have time. I'm in my first year as a PhD student. Not yet a PhD candidate. You have to finish your qualifying exam to claim that title.
I guess so. Yeah.
So student.
You will be.
I will.
Yeah.
Yep.
So in just growing these plants here on Earth, simulating space, what have you learned about growing plants using hydroponics and these LED lights and this
So I hadn't really done anything with hydroponics before I took this project on. I had grown a lot of plants in soil, but not really anything other than like starting seedlings in hydroponic type things. So I've learned a whole lot about how hydroponics works. It's been a lot of catching up to do on the basic knowledge of how the systems work, why we do things the way we do them, and then taking a look at why do we do them and are those reasons still valid when I go into a space segment.
Can you give an example?
So an example, let's take the actual nutrient film technique where you use gravity-fed systems to have the water go down a channel and then drain out. That won't necessarily work.
When you have globules of water?
In theory, what you'll need to do is have a higher flow rate of water and have pumps pushing it out and a pump on the drain sucking it in.
Really?
That's my theory. So I'd like to look at that.
Interesting.
So that's just one example of how things are different. We do know plants grow in microgravity, therefore they will grow just fine in lunar gravity. At least small plants. We don't know about larger plants because we've never grown anything larger than like lettuce or dwarf varieties of like bok choy and stuff.
Right.
It will be very interesting to see how the capillary action that pulls water from the roots up through the leaves and stuff actually works in lower gravity systems. We don't know if we'll end up with shorter plants or taller plants because of it.
Oh, that's so interesting. It could totally go either way, couldn't it?
Yeah. We don't have the data. Nobody's done the tests.
That seems like a pretty simple test, no?
How will you get that gravity for that long of time without actually going there?
Aren't there like gravity simulators?
The closest we have are parabolic flights and suborbital flights. In a parabolic flight, you can get 10 to 30 seconds of lunar gravity.
Okay. That's not enough for an experiment, probably.
Not for a plant experiment. It might be enough to do the test on, like, say, the hydroponic system.
Okay.
Or something like that.
Wow.
But it wouldn't be enough to do a plant growth experiment. And then you experience 2Gs, and then you go back up and you do it again.
Oh, my God.
It's so much fun.
I believe you.
I have video on my Instagram and stuff of it. The suborbital flights, you get microgravity for up to a couple of minutes on the top of the parabola before you re-enter the atmosphere.
Okay.
So you don't actually, it's really hard to get lunar gravity. You can get microgravity by going up into orbit, up on like the space station. But without going to the other celestial body, it's almost impossible. We don't understand gravity enough to replicate it. We can do spin-based simulations.
Okay.
So in orbit, so in a microgravity situation, you could simulate lunar gravity for a longer period of time by spinning. However, because you're using a spinning force, you need a very large diameter item to be able to test what we were just asking about.
Yeah.
Because the smaller the diameter, the greater the difference between the simulated gravity at the root zone and the leaves are. If the leaves are in the center where it's microgravity and the roots are at the bottom, are we actually testing something valid?
Exactly.
So, yeah, there's a lot of
Wow.
complexity and there's a lot of challenges. So we can do component testing, we can do basics, but until we actually go there, we won't know which way it'll go.
So what are you going to do with all of this research? Or I mean, I know how this is going to be applied, but like, what do you want to do after you graduate?
I want to either work for NASA, for a company, or set up my own company to build the bioregenerative life support systems for NASA and SpaceX and whoever else is going.
Hell yeah. That sounds awesome.
So either work for one of them, do it myself, or
maybe all of the above.
all of the above works for me.
Right. Well, Megan, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. It was really fun talking about plants in space. And I learned some great things here during our conversation.
Thanks. It's been great being on the show.
Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of the short course. I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah.
And I guess I'll see you tomorrow.
I will see you tomorrow.
Awesome.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.